that access to meat and the essential fatty acids that are contained in wild animal fat, that actually helped catalyze the growth of our brains. Not only that, but the invention of fire played a huge role in that, and our ability to cook meat actually allowed this explosion of both nutrient and caloric density that helped really grow our brains into what they are today. I think people in the nutrition field, there's a lot of zealotry I've experienced, and people tend to identify with their diet so strongly that for some people it's almost like a religion, and people want to think in terms of black and whites. And the reality is that in science there are very few black and whites, and there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all diet. Everybody's different. We all have different genes. We have different genders. We have different fitness levels. But I'm pretty certain from the research that I've done that some meat, especially in the form of properly raised grass-fed beef, for example, pasture-raised eggs, wild salmon, I think these are very important to the growing, to the developing brain. And I say developing sort of jokingly in terms of the evolutionary sense, but since the mid-90s, we now know that the adult brain continues to change all throughout life. This is called neuroplasticity. Mm-hmm. We used to think that the brain was fixed by the mid-20s, only to begin a long, slow decline up until life. Bob, you know this, but now we know that there are regions of the brain that have been demonstrated to have the ability of neurogenesis. And so by supplying the brain with these important nutrients throughout life, I think this has become so critically important. You mentioned protein. So protein is definitely an important part of the conversation, but I think too often it becomes the only part of the conversation that people really talk about. They're like, well, you don't need to eat animal products to get protein. You can mix and match various grains and legumes to get complete protein, but not many in the United States are protein deficient. So I think it's really important to broaden the conversation out beyond protein and talk about other nutrients that are contained in meat that are really important to the brain. So preformed EPA and DHA fat. DHA fat, which is found in the fat of wild salmon, for example, is one of the brain's most important building blocks. And it's really important to get these fats in their preformed state in animal products. Those don't exist in plant foods. In plant foods, you only get short-chain versions called ALA, it's an abbreviation, and our bodies are very inefficient at converting ALA from flaxseed or chia seeds, for example, into their usable forms in the body. So I think it's very important to get these kinds of fats from animal foods. Aside from DHA fat, there are a whole host of nutrients that some of which we recognize and some of which we have yet to recognize that are considered conditionally essential. So you might not develop a deficiency disease by not eating them, but your brain is going to work better when you have more of these conditionally essential nutrients in your diet. One example of that I talk about in the book Genius Foods is a nutrient called creatine. Creatine is found in grass-fed beef. It's found in certain fish. People that work out a lot are very familiar with creatine because it's a very popular sports supplement with a robust efficacy and safety record. But creatine is also naturally manufactured in our bodies, and it's vital for proper brain function. And they've done randomized control trials where they look at vegans and vegetarians as compared to omnivores, and they found that when supplementing with creatine, which is just one of the nutrients that one researcher somewhere found the budget to study, they found that when supplementing with this nutrient, the cognitive performance of these vegans and vegetarians actually improved. And so, we could go on and on, but essentially what that means is, we've co-evolved with our food, right? And I think, as you mentioned, medicine tends to take this reductionist approach, and that happens in nutrition as well. Michael Pollan coined the term nutritionism to basically describe the fact that nutrition scientists love to distill foods into their requisite nutrients and then study those nutrients. And I think that's vitally important, don't get me wrong, but I think what gets lost when we try to apply those findings to our diets and our lifestyles is that we forget that we've evolved with food, which contains nutrients that we have names for, and many that we don't even yet have names for. Mm-hmm. So that's why it becomes, I think, so important from a cognitive and brain health standpoint, and just an overall body health standpoint, to not cut entire food groups out of your diet, particularly when we've had those food groups for such a long time in the evolutionary sense in our, as Homo sapiens.
Well, yes, and especially if we're replacing them with a whole bunch of words that most of us can't pronounce.
Yeah.
Exactly. So for everybody listening, okay, our guest today is Max-Lugavere. The book is Genius Foods: Become Smarter, Happier, and More Productive while Protecting Your Brain for Life. Stay with us. We'll be right back. You're listening to Answers for the Family.
Founded over 30 years ago to meet the needs of families in crisis, West Shield has continually focused on resolving issues that negatively impact families and businesses. Our signature therapeutic transportation service helps to ensure that adolescents in crisis are safely transported to specialized schools, programs, and treatment centers with unsurpassed experience and success. We are supported by our full-service licensed investigation agency that has legally, professionally, and compassionately located hundreds of runaways and teens. We are experienced and qualified to help, offering solutions which may include referrals to our international network of top professionals in the fields of educational consulting, psychology, psychiatry, and investigations. Simply put, West Shield Adolescent Services and West Shield Investigations are the best solutions when your family is facing a personal crisis. Call 1-800-899-8585. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's 1-800-899-8585. Or visit our website at westshield.com. Thank you.
And we're back. My guest co-host is Dr. Robert Fisher. Our guest is Max-Lugavere, and we are talking about your brain health. Kind of bottom line, it's your brain health. Max, we do have some questions that have come in either through the internet or through a variety of different channels that come in. This one reads, I am an assistant principal at a private school, and we have witnessed an increase in ADD and ADHD among our students. I'm convinced that diet is one of the major reasons, so a few of us are working with parents to research and create complementary and healthier menus for school and home. I was so excited to see your summary on the Answers website, and I wanted to ask the question, do you have any different or special recommendations of foods or diets specifically for children? And this is from Monroe in New Jersey.
Yes, definitely. So, when we talk about conditions which absolutely are increasing in terms of their diagnoses today, like ADHD, these are conditions that essentially involve neurotransmitters. In the case of ADHD, it's dopamine and norepinephrine in particular. And it goes back to helping facilitate healthy, fluid neuronal membranes, for one. I also tend to think that ADHD might be a modern problem. As hunter-gatherers, a member of our species had to be self-sufficient, right? Today, and ever since the first agricultural revolution, we became a culture that really valued specialization. A hunter-gatherer needed to be able to do everything himself, but a post-agricultural human really had to, we favored specialized education. There had to be somebody to grow the wheat, somebody to pick it, somebody to cook it, somebody to sell it, essentially. And so there's this theory that fitting an ancient brain into the requirements of the modern world might be like fitting a square peg into a round hole, so to speak. And this is why you see an overwhelming proportion of people with ADHD in more entrepreneurial careers, because it allows them to really take on a broader array of tasks. And I certainly struggled with, attention and focus all throughout my schooling, which I think in some way is what has led me to write this book. But I do talk about the fact that omega-3s, which again promote more fluid cell membranes, tend to help. And there's a small number of trials that have shown that omega-3 supplementation can actually help in scores of attention with both children with AD, HD, as well as children that have not been diagnosed. And there is also a relationship between omega-6 consumption and worse scores of attention. So I document this actually in Genius Foods in Chapter 2. And as my own sort of N of one anecdotal experiment, I can attest to the fact that since I really began researching the book and started putting these practices into play in my own diet and lifestyle, that my ability to focus, pay attention, tune out distraction has certainly improved as well. The role of diet in these sorts of things is definitely an area that is under hot pursuit by researchers. But at the end of the day, I think that as we await some sort of consensus statement, when it comes to diet and helping our children make healthier choices, I think there's no question but to act, especially when it's as simple as, removing the hyper-processed foods, the Pop-Tarts, the cereals, and things like that, and adding back in foods that are high in omega-3s, lower in omega-6 fats, and contain the kinds of micronutrients that the brain requires to thrive. Great question.
Yeah, I was going to say there's the other issue that I think is people pay a lot more attention to, which is weight loss. So here we have something, we're talking about the brain. It is the thing that controls the rest of our body. And I know that as a country, we spend, hundreds of billions of dollars on weight loss. So share a little bit about, those things that they can do that's helping their brain, and it's going to give them weight loss also.
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, there's actually an inverse relationship between the size of your waist and the size of your brain. The same factors that will put a person at increased risk for obesity. And we now know that 66% of the United States population is either overweight or obese. Also seem to wreak havoc on proper cognitive function. And so, in my book, I highlight if your goal is weight loss, there's a lot in the book that you'll be able to get. I highlight a form of fat loss that's now being called biochemical liposuction by some researchers for its ability to allow for fat oxidation, which again is good for our waistlines. But what I'm so excited about is the brain partakes in this party as well, because the brain loves to use fat for fuel. The fat that we have sitting around our waistlines is essentially like a spare battery pack for our brain. The problem is today in the standard American diet, the fact that, we have less leisure time recreational activity than ever before. We're eating 300 grams of carbohydrates per day. Essentially, we're denying our brains the ability from liquidating that fat, which is unfortunate. I think for people that are listening that really want to lose weight, calories do count, but I think once we start adopting a diet that brings back whole foods to the table, foods without ingredient labels, I think most people will watch the weight fall off fairly effortlessly. The food supply today has become awash in what are called hyper-palatable products. A lot of the most processed foods that line our supermarket aisles that now make up the bulk of American calories being consumed basically usually combine flavors and mouthfeels that push the brain to a bliss point beyond which self-control becomes futile. So we tend to think of it as being a moral failure when we go through that entire pint of ice cream or when we eat the bag of chips when we only intended to have one or two. But really, these foods are designed to be overconsumed. They're hyper-palatable. It's sort of like pornography for the mouth. But I think by alerting people to this and letting them know that it's not a moral failure, these foods are designed. You're hardwired to want to overconsume these foods. It'll help people keep them out of the shopping cart. And if there's a food in your shopping cart, it's as good as in your stomach. And instead, natural whole foods, they're a lot less prone to overconsumption. And I think when we base